Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Andreas Aktoudianakis, and I am a digital policy analyst leading the work on digital at the European Policy Center. And welcome to this online policy dialogue that we have organized for you today. I am here with an incredible panel of speakers and experts in this field that we're going to explore security by design in the DSA and DMA, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, as you know very well. And we're going to explore the links there for security and whether the EU's digital and data policy is fit for the purpose. So we're going to focus on the Digital Services Act and the DMA, but then later we're going to open up the debate and look at bigger questions around this and the geopolitics of it. And of course, we're going to have the time to reflect on these questions and your questions, the ones that you're going to send us using the chat box in the group. So thank you all for joining us here today. We are here with Mr. Michał Boni, Mr. Paul Timmers, Ms. Victoria Baines, and Ms. Raquel Jorge Ricart. And I'm going to start the discussion by offering some initial remarks about the state of play in the EU cybersecurity. I won't go into any details, so I won't bore you with my details. I'm going to go straight into our speakers after that, and we're going to have some initial remarks from all of them of around 5 minutes max. And after that, we're going to open the debate to the whole panel for discussion. And around 3 o'clock, I am going to turn to questions from our audience. So as we are discussing and you're listening to the initial remarks of our esteemed panelists, please also think about the questions you would like to ask, and feel free to send us your questions via the chat box, which I will be monitoring constantly. So thank you once again. And yes, we are exploring two topics today, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act. And interestingly, we want to look at the link there with security and cybersecurity more specifically. This comes very timely, of course, because as many of you will know, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union, announced a few initiatives there to kick off in 2022 with a Cybersecurity Resilience Act and other ideas. But for the moment, we have seen the European Union, the Commission, tabling a range of digital policy proposals over the last couple of years and rushing these proposals at fast forward as the COVID-19 pandemic has made digital the center of our lives and perhaps the world. So with all these developments taking place so fast, it is worth asking the question, how do traditional security questions now transform with digital being the center of it all? And how are the European Union's digital policies security proof? And how can the EU work together with its common-minded partners and allies to have a joint and convergent approaches on cybersecurity? So these are basically the questions. These are quite big questions, so we hope we do as much as we can. And without further delay, I'm going to immediately turn to our first speaker, Michał Boni, who is Senior Research Associate at Wilfried Martens Center and former MEP for the EPP group. Michał, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for invitation, because it's very important to participate in this kind of debate with all excellent panelists. First of all, I want to say that there is no possibility to develop digitally in all areas and parallelly to build the European digital decade without the special safeguards for the cybersecurity based on the legal framework and its implementation in all European Union countries, but at the same time practically implemented in industries, security by design present in all tools, infrastructures, and so on. In addition, there are significant factors for the digital compass for the European Union as digital literacy, skilled workforce, and disseminated attitude of cyber hygiene behaviors. It is important because it's starting from us, the possibility for making the world much more secure at the area of cyber secure threats. Secondly, after this digital literacy, rules for the data economy development and data society with a special meaning of personal data protection, which will be important for some future-oriented new models of data sharing, because it is the future. And third point, common rules for the platform's responsibilities, as it is proposed in the DMA and DSA legislation, with the challenge of the governance of the content and fair competition. The cybersecurity issues should be understood as the challenge for global and European measures. It means development of norms, standards, certifications, and tools for resilience. And it is the key objective to keep the European Union as a global norm setter at this area, as it was in the case of GDPR. It is very important. We are not only discussing about cybersecurity in the European space, we should discuss about the cybersecurity in the global space, especially we need to start stronger cooperation with the United States at that area. Also, the important is the challenge for national authorities and institutions, the most adequate and fully harmonized implementation of the European Union principles and the conditions for the cooperation of all partners in the digital value chain. And the challenge for the companies with a crucial task to establish the business network, to exchange the experiences and the best practice, risk analysis instruments, and the risk management. I think it is very important, and we need to remember about this. And last but not least, the challenge for us as users of millions of apps, users of many devices important for us in many roles, as for example, workers, managers, physicians, border guardians. We need to use the cyber hygiene patterns consciously, but first of all, to have security by design solutions. At the same time, we have to put the question, and it is related to the cybersecurity and GDPR obligations, if all current digital proposals, legislative proposals in the EU as DMA, DSA, Artificial Intelligence Regulation, Data Acts, Cybersecurity Acts, Network Information Security Directives, etc., are consistent, integral, and future-proof. The consistency means consistency in the sense of legal solutions and consistency of tools, machines, devices. It is very important because it makes possibility for better conditions for privacy and security by design. It leads me to the one problem as an example during this panel of DMA project. It is clear that we require as strong as possible the data protection in the sense of GDPR obligations and as effective as possible the security safeguards due to the Network Information Security Directives and Cybersecurity Act in all used by us devices. But on the other side, in the DMA proposal and the document voted by IMCO, there is an obligation to be open under some conditions for example, side loading and third parties accessibility to the gatekeepers applications and put on their own apps on their platforms. It is the tool, it was discussed publicly, to ensure the competition principle at the market. But we should have the certainty that this kind of solution will not bring some unintended consequences for the security and not undermine the default settings and the whole ecosystem. Because the definition of the area of third parties can be very broad, with not clear guarantees in the references to the security safeguards. In the changes in the Article 6 of DMA, point C, in the second part of this point C, there are those changes are going in the good direction, but I'm not sure if it is sufficient. So looking at the core European Union values, taking into account the privacy and security of our citizens and resilience of the economy and society, we have to consider the problem of consistency of all legal solutions addressed to the digital world and avoid unpredictable, negative, unintended consequences. This is the starting point from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michał. This is a very nice way to start off. You outlined most of the big questions we have and some of the issues we can focus on. So what are the objectives, but also what are the more specific obstacles and how they translate into specific parts of the regulations we have in mind, the DMA and the DSA today. So for that specific point, I will just turn now to Miss Victoria Baines, who is visiting fellow at Bournemouth University and has done some work on this, some very good work recently published. So Victoria, please, we are ready to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And for everybody's reference, I'm just going to share the published research in the chat there so that you can have a look at your leisure. I think Michał has set the scene very well indeed in terms of some of the tensions that we have here. And so I won't repeat in detail the points that he's made, only to say that I agree entirely with the tensions that you've brought out and that focus on unintended consequences of siloed regulation. I think what emerges from the DMA and the DSA for me is that there are presumed or explicit cutouts for security issues, but what they clearly are exemptions. They are exceptional. So if we're talking about this concept today of security by design, the DMA and the DSA simply are not security by design. They are security by exception, security by exemption, even to the point that it would appear from the current draft text of the DMA and the DSA that requests for exemption would have to be made every single time a gatekeeper or a VLOP, and we don't yet know, do we, entirely whether gatekeepers and VLOPs are the same or interchangeable or slightly different, that those exemption applications would have to be made each time. Now, I am a former security practitioner in law enforcement, but also working for a big technology company, and full disclosure, I used to work for Meta in law enforcement and security service relations when it was still called Facebook. And what I can say from my experience, and my published research details some of these case studies, is that, for instance, cross-platform information sharing and merging of data sets held on users on different platforms, but platforms owned by the same companies, are actually an essential, routine, everyday part of identifying and countering the activities of bad actors. Even in terms of how those big platforms like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, the data that they share with law enforcement to prevent terrorist attacks, to prevent children being sexually assaulted, this can quite often require the cross-fertilization of data from different platforms, particularly in cases where, for instance, there's criminal activity on one platform, but that person is anonymized, or that data can't be resolved back to an individual subscriber. That is then merged with data from another platform. That is essential in many, many cases to law enforcement and the security services to identify and locate a perpetrator, or to identify and safeguard a victim. So what we're really talking about in Article 5 of the DMA, is that if we have a blanket prevention of gatekeepers being able to merge those data sets, we could actually put people at greater security and safety risk. I'm sure that's not what is intended in the DMA and the DSA, but this idea of security as exceptional, as something that is subject to exemption rather than security by design, security baked in, is something that I do think we really need to address. Now, Michał has mentioned about the third-party data sharing provisions in Article 6 and third-party app installation. So I won't go down too much into that. But if we look at the DSA, actually, we have a strange focus on oversharing, over-disclosure of data. Now, I am all for transparency. I'm absolutely all for gatekeepers and VLOPs saying more about what they're doing behind the scenes, how they take decisions to remove content. And that is absolutely right and proper. But that imperative needs to be balanced. It needs to be weighed against over-disclosing how security operations are conducted in reality. So we all hear a lot about law enforcement and intelligence and security agencies. They say, we can't disclose the details of our operations or ongoing investigations. We can't disclose too much about how we do what we do, because then we're tipping off bad actors as to the tools and the techniques that we're using. Now, of course, in the DSA, there is quite rightly a focus on, in particularly Article 15, the facts and circumstances relied on taking the decision for content removal, including, where relevant, whether the decision was taken pursuant to a notice submitted in accordance with Article 14, where applicable, information on the use of automated means in taking the decision, including where the decision was taken in respect of content detected or identified using automated means. Now, those provisions, they rather assume that all users of the internet and of these large platforms are benevolent and infringe unwittingly, that they're not going to try and deliberately game the security operations used by platforms. And that really does risk tipping off those malicious actors, that they're subject to an investigation in the first place. And I would argue, having been the kind of person that serviced requests from law enforcement and intelligence agencies in a large platform, quite often those agencies have their own confidentiality requirements. So really, this is about balancing imperatives. When we think about network and information security, security operations online, it's all about control. ANISA's guidance is all about control. ISO 27001 is all about control. But competition and consumer protection is all about openness. And so we need to have those security representatives at the table for data governance legislation, because really, we're not just risking the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. To use a crude metaphor, we're risking the right hand chopping off the left hand and hampering its operations in the future. So that's it from me for the time being.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you for making this, using this stark metaphor to communicate it. I think that's a nice way, almost visceral point. No, thank you very much. It's very clear, and thanks for because this is also some of the details that are not communicated enough about the regulation. So it's good to go into details while at the same time getting a clear idea about what the world would look like once these proposals are implemented. So these unintended consequences that Michał mentioned and you elaborated on. Thank you so much for this. I'm just going to turn now immediately to Mr. Paul Timmers, who is Senior Advisor on Digital Transformation and Cybersecurity at the European Policy Center. But this is just one of the things that he is keeping himself busy with. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We're ready to hear from you.
It's a great pleasure to be kept busy here in this panel and with these great panelists and with you, Andreas. Let me take a bit broader view rather than going into the DMA and DSA, specifically a bit more the geopolitical perspective and the strategic autonomy perspective. And I thought I can take as an example, as a lead in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, because that's where these issues also play a role, even if it is as an undercurrent. But just as a brief reminder, when I talk about strategic autonomy, really talking about the capabilities that we need to have, whether that is legislative or in terms of technology that we have, or in terms of diplomacy, to safeguard sovereignty, our sovereignty. And you can do that either by doing everything yourself, you can do it by working with your strategic partners, you can do it by trying to make deals at a global level. And Michał also hinted a little bit at that, and you yourself also, Andreas. And you can also do that by kind of doing the best that you can do, kind of a risk management type of approach. And by the way, that sounds like not so wise, but almost everything we have done in the past is risk management. It's not very much a strategic partnership of like-minded. It's not so much global approaches. It's doing the best that we can do. Anyway, when you look at the TTC, so the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, cybersecurity comes up actually quite often. You know, there is a working group about secure supply chain. So that is really supply chain security in the cybersecurity sense. There's a working group on security and competitiveness of secure infrastructures, the digital infrastructures and cloud. There is a working group on the misuse of technology, and they are talking, for example, about the threat of internet shutdown. So that's all hardcore cybersecurity, you might say. And then there is also a working group that is more actually at the center of attention in this discussion. That's the working group 5 in the TTC, which is called Data Governance and Technology Platforms, which is about coping with disinformation on the internet and also with the power of platforms. And cybersecurity is kind of implicit in that, because that's where you might have the misuse of cybersecurity, cybercrime, the spoofing of information, disinformation, etc., that is used there. And also this kind of delicate balance that we are just discussing now about the platforms who may be very well placed to deal with cybersecurity risks. Nevertheless, we also consider that the platforms are a threat for strategic autonomy and sovereignty, because they have become so big and powerful. You know, the valuation of Apple and Google is larger than actually the GNP or GDP of most European countries, approaching that of the largest one of France and Germany. So there are these kind of sensitive issues that are dealt with in the example of cybersecurity related to data governance and platforms, and cybersecurity and supply chain, cybersecurity and infrastructures, actually in a relationship that we have with the United States that's developing. So there, apparently, we are going into a direction that we are saying, well, we can deal with a number of these challenges really in a collaboration between like-minded, with all the uncertainties that are around that. Well, there are quite some uncertainties around that. Can we really deal with that? First of all, DMA and DSA are not explicitly on the agenda. Actually, they're explicitly not on the agenda of the TTC, because the negotiations on DMA and DSA are happening somewhere else, you know. But nevertheless, implicitly, of course, the issues are there. Secondly, we also need to think about it that even if we may be hopefully like-minded and stay like-minded also beyond the American elections or beyond the French elections, who knows what's going to happen there, then still there is ultimately another objective. The objective of the United States is national security. The objective in Europe is our security. And national security in the United States may be helpful for European national security, but it's not the same. So we need to be clear also that even if we collaborate on practical things like, for example, standards in cybersecurity, specifications, supply chain security, there may be ultimately a different objective at the very end that we have in mind, the sovereignty objective. And that's always in international relationships. It's always like that, you know, but we have to be aware of that because we might get things confused. Now, thinking about it, where we are moving, I would think that if you look a little bit from a distance, that actually Europe is getting increasingly well positioned to deal with its strategic autonomy. And why is that? Not only because it has been put on the agenda, but also because strategic autonomy is really actually a reaction movement. It's a reaction to geopolitical threats. It's a reaction to the threats of the platforms and the disruption of the internet, and it's a reaction to cybersecurity threats. And those threats, all of those threats, have not become less. They continue to be there. So I see actually that the topic will not go away. Strategic autonomy will, and cybersecurity will stay very much in the attention because these forces will continue to play a role. And gradually, Europe is starting to get its act together. Why is it also getting, what are signals of that? Well, signals are, for example, we have seen very rapid progress in actually the legislative negotiations on key legislation that has to do with cybersecurity and that has to do with strategic autonomy. So the Analyst 2, for example, the DMA and DSA, we see now DGA, the Data Governance Act, and we can be, I think, quite hopeful that the same will happen for example, a Data Act or a CHIPS Act, or a Cyber Resilience Act, as has been put for 2022. And I think also there is a degree of something of understanding what we are actually talking about when we talk about strategic autonomy and cybersecurity. We no longer have this kind of image that some people thought we had, that it is about autarky. That's certainly not. We no longer have this image of taking back control. It's actually not about getting back something that you want to get under control that you never had in the past. It's about the future, not about the past. It's about the future is still far ahead of us. There's still a lot to come. It's about Europe playing a role in that, an autonomous role in that. It's also not about wanting to have it all. We have to have focus, and you see this focus coming. There may be areas in which we actually do want to go alone as Europe, but these are exceptions, really exceptions. And these are things like hardware security modules. Now, finally, there is also a specific kind of branch to cybersecurity and strategic autonomy, and these discussions is perhaps more the cyber defense side and the strategic, the strategic military side. That's kind of still to be developed, and it will be very interesting to see how it will develop. But you see there too a trend to increasingly do things back to back between the military side and the civil side, and that's kind of also reflecting how it's happening in other parts in the world too. For the good or the bad, whatever you find about that, but our proposals there in the strategic compass, like the Joint Cyber Unit, for example, these are very important for our cyber resilience and our cyber defense, both. By the way, those are areas where we will, I think it's unlikely that we will work together with the United States. This is really Europe on its own. Now, in short, let me just summarize. I think overall, what we see is there is a stronger approach to cybersecurity. It's moving away actually from the approach in the past, which was risk management. It becomes much more something that actually does take the notion of strategic autonomy and sovereignty seriously. It becomes more often something that we will do together with like-minded partners, and I think we can keep our fingers crossed that this is also in the transatlantic relationship. Or in certain cases, it's EU only. Or what we will actually also see, and already see sometimes, is coalitions, smaller coalitions within the EU, so not all the countries together. Despite what has been said about DMA and DSA, I think there is a more consistent approach in legislation to include cybersecurity overall, but it's incomplete. We do not mobilize all of the tools that you need to have in place. And I think Michał illustrated it very well. We don't have a close connection actually between skills building and legislation like NIS2 or legislation like DSA or DMA. We also need to have that part of skills and investment. And I think we generally see that yes, strategic autonomy actually works as a unifying and a driving force. Whether you like it or not, it acts in that way. It's not too narrow-minded, the approach that we see developing now, and actually what some people feared, that kind of strategic autonomy and sovereignty would be hijacked by certain countries. I don't think we see that really happening. That's also not the case. So these are my words for now.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is extremely useful and comprehensive. Thank you very much for this, and touching all the geopolitical questions and how many of those should we think within the TTC, and of course some of those that we should think within Europe, and also in connection with the narrative on strategic autonomy. We'll get back to that in a second, because I have a few questions there, and thanks so much for your influential input. I will turn now to Raquel, Jorge, Ricart. Raquel is policy analyst in technology, digital and cyber policy at the Elcano Royal Institute in Brussels, and has done quite a lot of work in some of these questions. And I think she also has a good view about some of the national and regional questions when it comes to cybersecurity. I'm going to leave this for Raquel to frame exactly as she likes. Raquel, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, Andreas. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the EPC and as well to yourself, Andreas, and to the rest of panelists for being here, as well to learn and try to contribute to the discussion on security by design in the DSA and DMA. When it comes down to see how we can connect the dots between member state and the EU level policy making in terms of both cyber and digital and the digital services package, I see that actually there are two main directions. First of all is how we can ensure or guarantee that existing or previously existing cyber mechanisms in terms of cybersecurity, cyber capacity building, cyber maturity may help foster, enhance the very digital services package as such. And on the other hand, how the DSA and the DMA may guarantee, as Paul, Victoria, and Michał have been talking about, how they can enhance this data security, ICT security, etc. So I would like to go a bit further on the case of the DSA and later on the case of the proposal on the DGA, the Data Governance Act, because actually when we see the DSA, the Digital Services Act proposal, we see that it says that each member state will designate a competent authority, right, which will be called the Digital Services Coordinator. And we see that the enforcement of the proposed DSA is primarily a task of national competent authorities, except for some unresolved problems or perhaps some systemic risks which should be addressed by the European Commission as such at the very high level of the European Union. The point with this is that when it comes down to see how these digital services coordinators at the member state level may coordinate, for example, upon a cyber incident, a cyber threat, a cyber crisis, or anything on the DSA which may put at risk some information, some data issue, or even the data security framework. One of the main concerns with this is that how actually these digital services coordinators may be designated by which ministry, by which agency, by the Prime Minister, by the Prime Minister's cabinet at the national government level, right? So how we can guarantee that all member states actually have a quite similar approach to designating a specific digital services coordinator, and how all of them may communicate in a actually fluid way. In this, there is an interesting point when you look at the DSA, which says that in those EU-wide cases where very large online platforms raise systemic risks, the European Commission will guarantee the level of assistance required to deal with the complex technical and also society issues posed by the biggest online platforms. On this, it is important to see how systemic risks, first of all, are defined. So what the European Commission means by systemic risks, because actually when we look at the data security frameworks implemented by different member states, we can see that actually there are some countries where the issue of critical data, strategic data are differently defined not only in terms of the content, and not only in terms of the scope of what critical data means. It is also an issue on how in a specific country, this critical data issue is dealt by the Ministry of Defense. In other countries, this is dealt by the Ministry of Economy and Digital Transformation, and by others, it's actually mainly managed by the intelligence community. On this, the DSA, I think this is an opportunity for the current discussions on the DSA to see how some bits of data security may be managed either by the intelligence community, and this also makes me think about the role of the upcoming EU Joint Cyber Unit. The EU Joint Cyber Unit states that actually we will see how member states can not only they not only exchange relevant information on a need-to-know basis, also on a need-to-share basis. And on this, it will be important to see how data security at the DSA is guaranteed not only by the Joint Cyber Unit, but also to see how this will not be only a policy crisis. This will not only be a policy issue which will be resolved through a crisis management framework, but also how, for example, the Union may respond to a crisis that has touched on the DSA through a cyber attack, for example, at the political level. Let's remember, for example, the blueprint for coordinated response to large-scale cybersecurity incidents from 2017. And with this, I finish because I think that we can discuss further on.
Super. Thanks very much, Raquel. Thanks so much for this. And yeah, thank you for pointing out some of these issues and the difficulties of with relation to the governance in these proposals. This will definitely be some very important questions that member states will have to consider. And obviously here having a consistent and coherent exchange between the different national authorities would certainly smoothen things out in the implementation. And I say implementation, and I'm gonna take this keyword and come up with a question to all of you for this. So now the panel is open for discussion, and we're gonna be addressing some of these questions. So I will be, of course, addressing questions to you in particular, but if you feel that you would like to add to a question I have already asked to somebody else, please feel free to raise your hand and I will give you the floor. And in the meantime, I would like to also ask our audience to already think about their questions if they have any, and write them in the chat, which I have been monitoring and I haven't seen so many. So please share your questions already. Thank you. So yeah, implementation of the regulations. And I would like now to take a step back from everything we've heard, which has been extremely useful in setting the scene. And yeah, take a step back. And we are talking today about security, but we have had 2 years already of talking about digital policies. Why are we talking about security now? Why are we not talking about security 3 years ago or 4 years ago? And I'm asking these questions thinking also about the GDPR. For example, we established the GDPR in the EU, and then we thought about how can we benefit from data. And now we are establishing the Digital Services, Digital Markets Act, and then we're talking about how can we make these acts security-proof. Why are we talking about this now and not earlier? And perhaps I can address this question to Michał, if you would like to offer some remarks on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I remember that the discussion about Network Information Security Directive #1 has started in 2012, something like that. And during the term 2014-2019, it was voted finally and implemented. But during the time, it was clear that we need to go further. And for example, to discuss about some solutions. Just one point, in the treaty, we have security in the competences of member states. And I remember the debates, not only between members of the European Parliament, but also with some delegations from member states, that it is not clear if cybersecurity could be discussed and that we need some kind of common harmonized solution for the European Union because there is national competences and so on. So it was the first problem, yes. The second, I think that we understand as more as possible cybersecurity issues and problems as digital world is developing, yes, because 10 years ago it was not so clear how cyber attacks and cyber threats can change the world and our minds and so on and so on. So on the other hand, I can add something to that view presented by Raquel on institutional capacity, because in my mind there is a big problem when we are analyzing the implementation of GDPR. There are some problems in some countries, and not and some articles from GDPR are not fully implemented in some countries, and there are some different interpretations also in Germany. There are different interpretations of some articles related to the sensitive data, which create the problem how to use those data when we are discussing about the new model of healthcare systems, yes? So I think that we are discussing in the European Union about some solutions, but we have no power for proper implementation those solutions, yes, and it is causing the situation in which there are different implementations. It's especially it's related to the directives, yes, because if it is regulation, it's much more clear. So two issues: harmonized implementation at the same time done by the countries, and on the other hand, institutional capacity. Because when I'm looking, for example, I'm from Poland, when I'm looking at my country, there is no independent institution responsible for data protection. It's not independent, it's established by the political groups, political party, and there are some problems for citizens, yes? And the same situation we can have when we will discuss about these national competition authorities, or the same situation we can have when we will discuss about these Digital Services Act coordinators, because Digital Services Act coordinators should play clearly when we are discussing about how to remove this kind of content or not. So I think there are many problems, and finally I want to say that we need not only to finish our work when we have the legislation, as for example DMA and DSA will be after negotiations in trilogue voted and implemented, but we need to have some kind of guidances for implementation, yes, with clear requirements for from all institutions and member states. Yeah,
thanks very much, Michał. I'm gonna just see both Paul and Raquel would like to respond to that. I'm just gonna turn to Raquel in a second, and then to Paul, and just maybe ask for let's talk about this more, especially the regional differences. You said we need a harmonized implementation, we need guidance, but at the same time, at the regional level, we see there are differences, both in terms of capacities to implement, but both in terms of other issues such as digital skills and STEM, science, technology, economics, mathematics. Sorry. So I'll just turn to Raquel now. And Raquel, how would you reflect on that? Thank you.
Yes, so actually I wanted to follow up on what Michał said, because actually when he was talking about this need for harmonized implementation mechanisms or frameworks, I thought about the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers frameworks. And actually when you look at some of their reports, you see actually when you look at the data that actually national competence authorities are one of those participating members in these information sharing frameworks, but actually they are not on the top of those groups which participate the most in these frameworks. And actually, for example, imagine that building upon the DSA, you have there is some concern about deleting a specific message or a specific a thread of messages because it fosters like hate speech. You will need these national competent authorities to be part of these information sharing and analysis centers meetings, regular meetings, right? Or at least info sharing frameworks, because otherwise, in terms of institutional dynamics, in terms of policy design, especially in terms of policy accountability, they will not be part of it. So actually there is a need for a common language. And actually common language means, first of all, as Michał said, implementation mechanisms or harmonized mechanisms, but especially to try to help all these policymakers working with different languages to have a common language and plain language, which is not that easy. And in terms of what you said, Andreas, for national state capabilities, I also think about those countries which have sub-regional governments or sub-regional innovation ecosystems, where actually some of them are mostly participating or collaborating with other sub-regional ecosystems across the European Union, but still perhaps they do not have that high degree of participation at the national level, in terms of data security. So there is a need as well to train the policymakers.
Absolutely, yeah. There's always that need, and technology runs much faster than policymakers, especially if we think about the EU's legislative machine. But yeah, definitely a very good point. Thank you, Raquel, for this right-click save on this. I'm just going to turn to Paul immediately because he had his hand up before we lose the thread. Paul, please.
Hi, yeah. Let me try to connect the threads because first of all, I agree with Michał that the perceptions on national security have really changed from the times that we were in 2012 being told as European Commission, I was there, move out of the area of the NIS directive because that's not your business. You are using the wrong article out of the treaty. You don't have competence there. This is Article 42. You don't have competence in national security. We said, no, it's Article 114. It's internal market because if you disrupt in one country, you will feel the effects in other country. And we have a lot that is operating across the whole continent. Ultimately, we won the day, at least on the legal basis. And so it became an Article 114, which is really cooperation and not cooperation, it's legislative harmonization in the internal market. Now, that kind of breaks an assumption, namely the implicit assumption in 2012 was, as it was told, national security means do it on your own, don't share, don't be open, don't collaborate. And then actually after a while, people realize if you don't collaborate, you're actually weaker than when you do collaborate. And this has been illustrated, so you have to collaborate, but of course, no one trusts each other, so you need to build trust, etc. And good ways to build trust are actually external threats, as we always know. So one of that was WannaCry in 2016. People started to work together and saw that they could actually work together, even if, talking about regional, there are regionally quite different capabilities. You can start building a degree of collaboration. The 5G security dilemma was a way to collaborate. And what did all these countries say that said it's all national security? They said, why don't you, European Commission, organize the meetings where we can talk together about 5G security? So apparently some degree of trust has been built up because there was a big external threat that couldn't be dealt with individually. And if you do it together, you are actually individually stronger. So actually, and that's important, where you collaborate with like-minded, especially in the EU, you actually strengthen your national sovereignty by strengthening European sovereignty. It's a win-win rather than a win-lose, which is quite different from the assumption that we have in a number of other cases where we talk about transfer of competence to the European level, which is the loss of national sovereignty. I don't need to talk to Michał about the disputes that we have about the rule of law in Poland, which is the basis there. Now, there is another kind of assumption that I see emerging that I think we need to be careful about. That is the assumption that open is in contradiction to secure. And so if we talk about DMA, DSA, and we talk about a degree of openness, we need to say what is the part where you cannot be open and what is the part where you can actually be open because it's better. And so you see many of the solutions that are working best and are most secure are, for example, open source solutions that are globally open sourced. And they work best because they are fully inspectable. And everybody can share that, but you can make your own implementation. There's certainly stuff that we cannot be open about. I mentioned hardware security modules, you know, the core of encryption, for example. The algorithms can be open, but the way we implement that, we may not want to reveal to anyone else. So not everything needs to be open. So I think we need to really be like, you know, in the past we had this manipulative debate. Let me characterize it this way: that regulation is in contradiction to innovation. You know, it's just a blanket statement and the discussion stops. I'm against regulation because I'm in favor of innovation. It doesn't work that way. I'm against openness because I'm in favor of security, or the other way around. It doesn't work that way. So a bit of dissecting and nuance would be good.
Super. Thanks very much, Paul, for this. And thank you for framing it in this assumption. So as you said, cyber was a national security issue, and thank you for this narrative to the younger analysts here. This is really useful for us. Thank you, Michał and Paul, for this. But it quickly became an issue once there was a common external threat. And perhaps I could use this framing to, and yes, of course, you also mentioned that what is open is not necessarily a contradiction to security, and maybe now I can use this thread to turn to Victoria. And Victoria, you know, how do you reflect on this phrase? Open is not a contradiction to security, especially with relation to the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act. I'm thinking specifically about the DSA because I was working on a project that we tried hard to have Article 31 as part of the Digital Services Act, which is about data sharing with independent researchers, investigative journalists, and hopefully we were trying to have also civil society in that article, but I'm not sure it went so well. But in any case, yeah, this was an article about transparency and about open, right, about data access. So how would you reflect on that from the point of security? Thank you.
So I think Paul's statement is absolutely spot on, and I would agree with it entirely. So that the fact that openness and control, or openness and security, as he frames it, they pull in different directions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're incompatible in specific situations. I think they are compatible. It's a case of delineating, as he says, you know, what controls are required and what can be open. But to your point about the Digital Services Act, look, one of the things that Raquel mentioned was the role of the Digital Services Coordinator. Now, as that is envisaged, there will be a central database where the digital services coordinators will all be able to see each other's takedown requests, each other's requests for content removal. Now, I can see why that would be streamlined, but this will include potentially, unless there is a specific cutout for this will include requests by law enforcement and intelligence and security agencies for removal of terrorist content, for removal of child sexual abuse material that may be subject to ongoing investigations. So this raises a really important question about access control. You know, we have that openness and sharing, but we need some really good vetting. And this doesn't mean that I don't trust the people who are going to be designated as digital services coordinators, as, you know, by their competent authorities. But we need to audit and monitor who has access to this system. Maybe not every digital services coordinator needs to have access to all of the requests. Maybe there is a more secure part of that system. So it's really getting into the granularity of implementation. It's great to have these digital services coordinators, but how exactly is this going to work? And to your point, Andreas, about Article 31, I am, as a researcher myself, I am all for having access to good data from the platforms. One of the things that the Frances Haugen whistleblowing scenario has revealed is that somebody who used to work for the company who has a very limited data set that is taken out of context is not the best way to drive policy. We need routine, independent research having access to that data, not former insiders and not the media deciding what we're going to have access to. But then it goes back to access controls. Surely not everybody should have access to that data. There should be perhaps either a call for proposals or some kind of vetting procedure and quality control. That's what I want to see a little bit more focus on. Is great, we've got the aspirations. How are we going to build security into the implementation?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's $1 million question there. Thank you very much for this, Victoria. As you said, yeah, I definitely see your point, but and perhaps I could follow just a little bit on that, a bit more, because you see, very much what we hear from other groups in Brussels and from civil society representatives is about this definition of trade secrets, and what I have in mind here is you have a public that doesn't trust so much governments and authorities anymore, and they don't seem to trust very much companies that are driving tech in the middle of the pandemic. But at the same time, these companies are the backbone of many basic economic and social activities. So do you think that, and apologies if I put you on the spot about this, do you feel that this definition of trade secrets is legitimate, or do you think that perhaps some of the stakeholders that are feeling there is a vulnerability there about how you define trade secrets, do they worry more than they should be worrying? I don't know. This is quite a broad question and quite abstract too, and I'm not sure if you would like to answer that, but if you don't, I will just.
I'm more than happy to answer that. Having worked for governments, but also for tech, I can see both sides of this problem. I think there have certainly been cases in the past where some tech companies have perhaps hidden behind the definition of trade secrets. But equally, I think there is bad faith quite often on the government side and a talking past each other, which is not very helpful. There's mistrust. And I think that sometimes can inform, it can result in a lack of information available to the public. And, without wanting to go down into the whole end-to-end encryption debate, that is a debate that is very much determined by what tech companies say, what the media says, and what governments say. There is not necessarily a lot of information at the public's disposal to make decisions about, what level of security and encryption they would like, what level of law enforcement and intelligence agency intrusion into that security they would accept. It seems to be something that is very much in an echo chamber of sorts. Now, how do we get around that? Well, one of the ideas that I'm really attracted to is Wolfgang Eschinger's suggestion that we might have a European security supervisor in the same way that we have a European data protection supervisor. Now, we don't want this to run on forever so that we have a limitless number of supervisors, because then it gets all very messy. But just having oversight that when there's legislation in train, when there's new policy, there is an officer who is designated to be that focal point for all of the concerns around security issues, to be the vetting, where the buck stops, so that someone does have a specialist input here. Because otherwise we risk, legislation being developed in verticals by different DGs, and not necessarily having full scrutiny or full input from security specialists. So something like that, I think, could be quite promising.
Thank you, Victoria, and thanks. This links also very well with other things we've heard earlier about challenges at the national level, then challenges at the EU level, governance, and how to coordinate approaches to security in a way that is uniform and consistent with other initiatives taking place and others that will be taking place soon. Maybe, the angle of regulation, I think, is we have covered that to a sufficient degree, perhaps. I mean, we could always go on forever on this, but perhaps, we could think a little bit about from the citizens' point of view and the consumer's point of view, perhaps too. And I remember, we touched upon this earlier. Michał said, for example, the significance of having digital skills and digitally literate citizens who can make their decisions on cybersecurity with greater ease. But there's also many of the national authorities that these consumers or citizens, right, would turn to. These national authorities, very often they don't have enough means in order to address all of this. I'm thinking here about a report that Access Now published, I think in early 2020, about how many data protection supervisors, data protection agencies in member states, they had their resources leveraged essentially because they were addressed with so many requests, and it was just impossible to address all of those. So who would like to reflect on some of this? What can we do really to okay, we're talking about regulation with cyber, but what can we do to boost the citizens' strength in dealing with all those? I'll just turn to Paul because I saw he raised his hand. Thank you, Paul.
Perhaps just a few comments about it. I think that where we have groups that are addressed through the legislation, so take NIS, DMA, DSA, operators, providers, authorities, intermediaries that are that are in the game. There, we are actually expecting a certain level of capability, and that's written in the law. And that I think you can actually support by common approaches also at European level. So, if we expect that let's take another kind of example than what we have here on the table, but if we expect that the energy sector does a good job in terms of the resilience of the energy networks, including for cybersecurity, and they are under the law, and they have also written down themselves certain type of requirements, then we can expect that they raise the level of their competences jointly, as we also expect that in certain other sectors. If you take health, before you can operate in the health sector, you need to have a certain level of competence, and you are regularly being retrained, and there are common protocols and those kind of things, in this case issued by the WHO. It's a global level, but we could do that at European level, and funding for that can be allocated in programs like, for example, either the sectoral programs like energy, health, etc., or a horizontal program like Digital Europe, I would think. It's much more difficult when we talk about the skills of smaller companies that are not under the law, citizens and consumers in general. There, I must honestly say, after many years of seeing the good intentions around digital literacy in Europe, that are always pronounced, and also money is made available for that, we still don't see the progress that is needed. There is a lack of course, mandate at the European level. No competence. So I think if I continue finding that, let's put it politely, a challenge from the European level on citizen and consumer competences.
Thank you, Paul. I'll just turn immediately to, I don't remember if it was Michał or Raquel who raised their hand first. I just don't remember who did it. So I'll just maybe turn to Michał first. Would you, yeah, is that the case? Yeah, Michał, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Paul mentioned 2 minutes ago that we need some kind of capabilities at the different kind of levels, the European level and also the national levels. But I want to add something about awareness and this digital literacy. I fully agree with Paul that there are many problems with this. But on the other hand, we need to discuss about education and to incorporate the issues related to the awareness of our data and awareness of cybersecurity issues, this cyber hygiene attitude to curricula, to the school curricula. Of course, at the beginning, it requires to prepare teachers, but I think that it is crucial, yes, because we are trying to make something at the university levels. We are discussing about how to inform publicly about some solutions, but I think it's not sufficient. So we need to come back to the beginning and to give some tools to the teachers and to change European, in member states, European curricula related to those topics. So this is the first point. The second is related to understanding how to overcome some resistance at the area of politics, of being much more open for citizens, yes, because this is my experience, yes, when political groups are not so open to meet and to discuss some issues. For example, when we are discussing now thinking about DSA and DMA, and in DMA there are some points related to targeted advertisement. There is a lack of rational debate about this. This is some kind of black-white position, but I think that we need to analyze much more precisely many possibilities of making advertisements in platforms and using platforms for them. And I want to give the example with the problem of explainability. Some years ago, when civic organizations raised the problem that some solutions related to artificial intelligence should be presented in the explainable way, it was some kind of resistance done by companies also. But today we see that there are very strong activity and involvement of Google, Microsoft, and others presenting the rules for explainability. So we can discuss also discussing about artificial intelligence regulation. So step by step, I think that we need to go forward. But firstly, it is important to know what kind of points are important, are crucial for civic society for creation the trust. If we want to create the trust, we need to have partners in this kind of discussion and some kind of social, societal support.
Thank you very much, Michał. I'll turn immediately to Raquel. Raquel, thank you. Just, please let us know. And I'll go back to some of the points you have all mentioned. Thank you, Raquel.
Yes, actually, I wanted to perhaps highlight some points on not the DSA and DMA as such, but the Data Governance Act and these documents that have been released in last weeks. Actually, when we look at the DTA and we read the part on data altruism organizations, and actually Andreas and I, we have talked about that on this issue, we see that actually it's mainly focused on research and academia, and especially on goals of general interest. So on this, it is important to define actually what we mean by general interest, actually how this goal of general interest may entail not only the general interest from a policy perspective, from an economic perspective, from even disinformation perspective, but also how different strategies on cybersecurity, on the Internet of Things, on AI, on the DSA, DMA may interact to define actually what we mean by general interest, because maybe for some stakeholders, as Michał said, a specific goal will be A, but for another stakeholder, the goal of general interest will be B. And then I was reading this morning some of the main takeaways from the consultation on the Data Governance Act, which was released yesterday by the Commission, and it's interesting to see that actually, and actually I have it here, 70% of the respondents consider that manufacturers of connected objects on the Internet of Things should not be able to decide unilaterally what happens to the data generated by them, and the data portability rights should be taken into account. Actually, this is important from the perspective of consumers and users, especially because sometimes we see that the Data Governance Act touches on personal data, but also on non-personal data. So for example, I think about this platform, the Osaka track, which was actually promoted by the Japanese presidency to the G20. Actually, they promoted a sort of non-personal data flows mechanism to make a G20 members to exchange non-personal data. So on this, once we see the Data Governance Act, we need to take into account both the personal and non-personal data. And it's not that easy to try to, enclose or to make interact several strategies on data for Internet of Things, on data for cybersecurity, on data on and the AI nexus.
Thank you, Raquel. I think that from all your points, we are pointing towards that this is basically not just a couple of regulations we're talking about that we're need to tie to security. We're talking about a whole ecosystem of regulations. And perhaps Ambassador Ischinger's point from the Munich Security Conference that took place relatively recently touches on that, sums up all of these concerns, perhaps in this point about an EU security supervisor that can address some of these in a more uniform way. Yeah, thank you so much for this. But and continuing on this train of thought about the ecosystem, as much we have an ecosystem of regulations, but we also have an ecosystem of businesses and stakeholders and social, and everything else, right? So, on this point, and I think somebody mentioned, I think it was Paul, who mentioned, drew up the distinction between the really big and competent and strong stakeholders and the smaller ones. And on this point specifically, ecosystem and small stakeholders, I wanted to touch on this other view that has made its way through the media from John Nafton, who's a professor of public policy at the Open University in the UK. And he published a piece on The Guardian, and he was trying to explain what is the connection, what should some of the small companies do? And here he brought in an example. He's pointing out how many small companies have been lame ducks for a long time with issues of cybersecurity. And to sum it up, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, these companies started dealing with a lot more data than they used to. And suddenly, around maybe hopefully the end of the pandemic, we have companies that have a lot of data, but they don't have so many security provisions. And these are small companies. So and then the point comes back to the consumer, because if you, I, or everybody listening to us as consumers have been working with these companies, and these companies offer very, very vital services, and then you have a cybersecurity attack, what are the companies going to do? Probably it's going to stop services to not have the cybersecurity attack become generalized. But in the meantime, the consumer loses out because you have been paying for the services, and you should be getting back the service you have paid for. At least that is what we would expect. So I wonder, how would you reflect on that? And I think perhaps Victoria already has the answer. Victoria, please. Thank you.
Well, not necessarily the answer, but perhaps some lessons learned and a parallel that we might be able to learn from, and that's GDPR. So, we saw this impacting large data controllers and data processors. And as you say, as we've all said, those are the companies that have the resources to hire bigger teams of lawyers, etc., to outsource to lawyers on retainer, for instance. For small and medium-sized enterprises, they're still data controllers and data processors. And so we saw, didn't we, in the run-up to 2018, a huge drive of this question, are you GDPR ready? And so we all data controllers, even if they were one person and a dog in an office, would be rushing to be compliant or ready and in May 2018. Now, what I've seen is that, after that initial push, there wasn't necessarily so much of a focus on, do you continue to be GDPR compliant? So, the routine introduction of privacy impact assessments for new types of data collection, for instance, we haven't necessarily seen that. We saw a ramping up and then a falling away of interest. But what we also saw was a huge amount of outsourcing a huge amount of outsourcing of data. And what I routinely work with charities and non-governmental organizations who are very small, don't have a lot of money to spend on preventing data breach notifications, security awareness, information security. And I say to them, look, you can outsource some of your security operations. You cannot outsource the liability as a data controller. You are still responsible. So I think we can kind of model that, if you like, and take some of those lessons and see what we might be able to replicate in the cybersecurity field.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Paul?
Perhaps I can continue on the point of outsourcing, because there's another form of outsourcing of liability which has happened by software vendors. So I must say that personally, I always was very surprised when we had the WannaCry attack, which at the root of which is that people didn't update their Microsoft Windows system, that these hospitals were blamed that they didn't update the software, which was faulty, coming from someone else. So somehow there's, I don't know if you feel it like that, but I feel it as injustice, that something can be put in the market, you're signing up for a contract and you don't have really another choice. And then ultimately, if you don't update the software yourself, but it's faulty software, you are being blamed for that. And you don't have the time, you don't have the resources. You have to keep yourself busy with your core business, which is health as a hospital, and not IT. So I think somewhere there is something askew in this. And the same holds also for SMEs that are now getting ever more data, and they do that on potentially insecure systems. Are we now going to do finger pointing to these poor SMEs that they didn't keep their system safe? Are we going to finger point to older people who didn't protect their mobile phone and fell into a trap? Somehow my personal feeling is we are here on a path to injustice. And therefore also I think we need to think about other approaches, and these might include that actually we do demand that insecure software is not being put in the market. Things that are already being now proposed, for example, for connected consumer devices, and perhaps in the future for under the Cyber Resilience Act, that could be a path to explore. And I already hear the debate coming up, but then we stifle innovation. Well, let's be ahead of that debate. Let's learn from the past. How can you put requirements for better quality products and services in the market, requirements that are hard requirements, and not stifle innovation? We must learn something from the past. So that's part, I think, also of the policy capability building. Do that and better have that analysis now would be a good topic for a seminar by EPC, I think. Rather than being surprised when suddenly there is something being proposed by the European Commission and everybody starts complaining about the damages to innovation that this will do.
Thank you, Paul. I think your ideas.
Yeah. I must say, that I give you.
Thank you, Paul. I think all your ideas will be very useful in our work, and you might see some of these in a form that resembles or another. So, I mean, that's extremely useful for our debate. I think, Michał, you have raised your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, just a small addition to what Paul said. Yes, because I remember that in 2017 and 18, when we have discussed in the European Parliament the Cybersecurity Act, it was a very big discussion about certification. And of course, we have established the solution that step by step, at the country level, at the national level, at the member states level, the certifications will start. It is the end of 2021, and I'm not sure if we in the European Union are advanced with creating these European certificates, yes? Because it's important to know that earlier we have 20 UK at that time have been the member of the European Union. We have had 28 systems of certifications, yes? And after that, in 2016, if I properly remember, 15 countries signed the agreement that certifications will be approved in different countries. Yes, but we need this kind of certification. It was what Paul said. We need to look at the accessibility of some devices, especially when we will go in the direction of, if I can say, one device in our pocket with all functionalities in the perspective of some years. So how important is to keep the stronger cybersecurity safeguards and also related to personal data and so on and so on. So the last point, we need to know what kind of problems are the most important. And my feeling about the DSA and DMA in the part of the discussion is that there were no focus on real challenges and real problems, how to solve them, but it was created as a tool against some companies. Yes, I'm sorry that I'm speaking about this, but I think that during this discussion we have mentioned many problems which should be solved in DSA and DMA debates, but they are out of the debate. So this is a real problem: how to focus on real problems, not on fighting with some companies.
Thank you, Michał. Yeah, absolutely get your point here, and the ideological conflict lines that are sometimes generated in this debate. Fully aware about that. I hope, and thank you for raising it, actually. Raquel, I just like a quick point from you, and then I need to address 2 questions from our audience. So please take the floor.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I just wanted to bring up the issue on how the DSA and DMA will be able to interact with these data marketplaces that are being promoted by the different Gaia X working groups. So imagine that, for example, the car working group within the Gaia X, which will mainly be promoted by a specific EU member state, which have a greater role in this specific sector, will create data marketplaces. So how these data marketplaces, where actually there will be non-EU companies, will be able to comply with all DSA and DMA points, and I think that on this there are some points where we can all agree or disagree, but it's a challenge. But I don't want to take more time.
Thank you, Raquel. Maybe some of the questions we're going to address now, going to give you the opportunity to touch on this more. And I'll just turn immediately to the questions we have from our audience. I'm going to focus first on a question focusing on companies, because we were talking about companies last. So Anna Maria Korka is asking, what would be the impact? What impacts do you foresee on companies? Companies will have to invest more to secure their data. And I think we discussed this a bit more. How do you see the impact on companies regarding getting ready for DSA and DMA entering into force? And I think this is a little bit about the implementation period, and something that Victoria maybe reflected on earlier, and how long it will take, and the support that some of these companies will need to have in order to do this, and see how compliant they are in the years to come. Perhaps we have addressed this already to a certain extent, but if you would like to add an additional thought, please go ahead. If someone would like to reflect on that, please unmute yourself. Okay, I get up. Paul, thank you, Paul.
Perhaps just one comment, that in a sense, DMA and DSA are also opening up new opportunities. So impact on other companies that are the platform participants may require, of course, that it is explained to them how DMA and DSA are actually working, but that are also equipped, for example, to put in place the greater opening up of payment, identification, and other ancillary services that are now being enabled if DMA comes into force. And obviously, you need to do that in such a way that you are maintaining security. So there must be clearly a big focus on security, on interoperability, on how you then make best use of the data, so that it's also understood by these companies how they can get more benefits from the platform economy. But I see that if we do it wisely, so there, I must say we learn also from the GDPR there. I think explanation needs to be added to it. I see it more as an opportunity than as a problem.
I really appreciate this point of view, especially as we have spent a long time in Brussels discussing about the problems with these proposals, but there are also quite a few benefits. And I think maybe Victoria would like to add something here too. Victoria.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, if we're thinking about those security exemptions, so this idea that you need to submit a request to be exempted from interoperability and portability and data sharing requirements, I think there is a potential for a real impact, particularly from some of the larger companies, from the gatekeepers and the VLOPs, on the European institutions themselves and on the digital services coordinators, because we're talking in the orders of millions of exemption requests here potentially, which could effectively be like a denial of service attack on the infrastructure for monitoring the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And I think that is a really interesting, fascinating for a researcher like me, but certainly not an intended consequence of some of these proposals.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Thank you for this. And there's another question there, but I see Michał has raised his hand. Please, Michał, if you would like to reflect on what you just said.
I just want to say that the problem of unintended consequence really exists. And when Raquel mentioned some additional legislative proposals as Digital Governance Act after consultation, Future Data Act, and so on. So I want to emphasize what I have said at the beginning, how important is consistency. Consistency of all those legislative portfolios when we are discussing about especially data protection and cybersecurity. So I think it should be required from the European Commission to present much more in much more clear way that it is consistent. My experience shows that there are in all digital portfolios, in all digital proposals of legislation addressed to, they are in comparison, and they are very well designed in reference to GDPR. But there are some problems when we are talking about cybersecurity. So this is the indication and for the future recommendation, if I can say.
Thank you very much, Michał. And thank you, everybody. I'm going to close this debate, but first, before I do that, and we have had such a wonderful time, at least speaking for myself, I guess you too, I would like to offer you an opportunity to perhaps sum up some of the things we've said in a last word kind of input. And maybe I will do this in the same order as we offered our initial inputs. I know, Michał, you just offered a point, so you mind if I go back to you immediately and ask you perhaps to summarize what you have already summarized, perhaps if you have some last words before we close the panel.
Yeah, well, very briefly, we need to ensure consistency. Stop, that's all.
Thank you very much, Michał. Victoria.
I'm going to take this opportunity to answer the fantastic question from Klaus in the chat, because it exactly speaks to tensions, which is going to be my keyword really. Very briefly, yes, I absolutely agree that some of the proposals going through the US Congress have these same tensions. We have moves like the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, all the antitrust, pro-competition stuff. But in addition, we have the strategic competition proposals, the anti-China proposals like the Strategic Competition Act. So what we're seeing is that tension between openness and security, but on top we want openness, but not for China.
Thank you, Victoria, and thanks for pointing out that the elephant in the room, we wouldn't be able to address it in the time we had, but thanks for touching on this briefly. Paul, please.
Yeah, having been a policymaker myself, I would say help the policymakers, because you want them to be, and rightly so, we want them to be consistent, to integrate policies, to be strategic so that they focus on the right things. And also, by the way, policymakers then are often in the same house as the ones that have to implement. They also have to do that. So they also need to understand the feedback loop to implementation. It's quite a tall order, but I think the best job that we can do is make things clear as much as possible in a neutral way, without trying to defend a specific position, first of all, so that the insight is there.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I'll go to Raquel now for, I think this makes an excellent transition considering the issues she discussed initially. Raquel.
Yes, actually, I don't want to repeat the same point that Paul made, but actually I am on the same line. So actually I think that help policymakers to have plain language, make policymakers be able to work not only within your own department, but also in terms of how you can engage with other actors. For example, this debate on national competent authorities for the information sharing and in intelligence analysis centers. And yes, that's all. And also try to engage not only the national level departments, but also how some sub-regional administrations may promote some, data security issues.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you everybody for your time here today, and a big thank you to our audience for tuning in and sending us their questions. And yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time. This maybe is going to be one of the times we speak. I'm sure we're going to speak again soon, and these issues are not going anywhere. We are going somewhere else after 1 hour and a half. Here discussing. So thank you all for joining me here today, and I'm looking forward to speaking again with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.